everyone, hope you guys are all having a great day. Today I am going to do a Stephen King video. I have read 3 Stephen King books within the last 12 months and I wanted to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about them. These particular Stephen King books I really enjoyed because they all take place within that particular world that Stephen King writes about. They also all take place either in part or in whole in Derry, Maine, which is just a terrifying place. Stephen King does an excellent job of setting up that story and that setting and building that story world. And all 3 books that I've read within the past year are part of that story world. So, the first book that I read and we'll talk about is It. The second book is Insomnia, and the third book is 11/22/63. So I will go ahead and get started. I read it last summer because it was coming out in theaters soon and I wanted to make sure that I read the story before I went and watched the new movie. It is the story of a group of misfit kids who band together to sort of hunt down and destroy this particular kind of evil that has overtaken their town. And then at the same time, you're getting the story of this group of children when they're adults and they have to come back to Derry, Maine to get rid of it once and for all. This story is so well done. Stephen King just does an excellent job of weaving together the past events and the future events, or what you might call the present events, and he just weaves them together seamlessly. He also has a wonderful cast of characters. The kids are just hilarious and sweet kids. They're funny. Each of their individual stories are really well developed, and then I loved seeing them as grown-ups as well. I will say the only character I didn't like was probably the main character, Bill. I'll get into this in a second, but I didn't really like Bill too much. I also really enjoyed the themes in this story, which include fear and friendship and love and how all of those 3 things sort of interconnect with one another. He also touches on free will a little bit, or a lot, I suppose, depending on how you want to look at it. How much choice do these children have in attempting to fight this evil that they encounter in their hometown? While the story is really well written and interwoven, I thought that the ending of the story was a little trippy and very metaphysical. He has some really good concepts, but they're difficult to understand. And that's actually one place where I think turning it into a movie was a really good choice, because you can get a better visual on what Stephen King might possibly be talking about when he's writing these scenes. Now, I will say the ending of the movie, It, is a little different from the ending of the book, for better or for worse, but it does give you a better visual of what might be happening. Speaking of the ending, I think one other big con for this book, not necessarily for me, but for most people, is that there's a pretty inappropriate scene at the end of the story that makes most readers pretty uncomfortable. I'm not going to go into the details of the scene, but it is a sex scene and it's shocking. Most people, I think, believe that Stephen King probably put that in there for shock value. That's not really what I think, though. I think if we look at the context of the scene, given the particular character that is involved, her past and background, and the situation that the characters find themselves in, I think you begin to realize what the author might be doing when he's including this shocking sex scene in the story. I think that Stephen King is trying to say that sex is more than just a physical act, and it's something that binds you to another person, and that is what these particular characters needed in this moment. They needed to be 100% bonded to each other in order to get out of a particular situation. And yeah, he could have done it. Stephen King could have made that point in some other way. I think he maybe probably should have found some other way to connect them. But he chose to do it. He chose to make his point in this way. And if we look at it the way I think he meant it, then it might not be as shocking. And there's actually a little bit of truth to it, because as it turns out, sex is more than just a physical act, and it does bind you to another person in pretty intense ways. So I think there's an element of truth to it, but it's still really inappropriate and really icky. And I think it's fair that many people read this story, get to the end, and are completely shocked and appalled by what Stephen King does. I was shocked and I was appalled, but again, I think there's a reason for it. I will say another con for me is this book, because I didn't like the main character. I tend not to like it when Stephen King writes main characters who are too much like himself. Bill in this story is supposed to be this just enigmatic kid, and people are drawn to him, and when he grows up, he's this awesome author who wrote his first books when he was young and in college, and it's just so typical Stephen King that I hate it. I do not like the main character. However, every other character in this story is pretty fantastic. The second book that I read this year is Insomnia. Insomnia is actually my second favorite Stephen King novel, and it is my favorite of the ones that I'm talking about today. In Insomnia, we are introduced to an older gentleman whose wife dies at the beginning of the story. And he's dealing with the loss of his wife, and he begins losing sleep. Over a period of weeks and months, the amount of sleep he gets decreases and decreases and decreases, so much to the point that he feels like he's going insane. And at a point where he's lost the most amount of sleep he's going to lose, he wakes up one night, he's sitting in his living room, and he sees something strange happening outside of his window. And events sort of take hold from there and snowball, and this particular main character and a couple of his friends sort of become involved in a story that shows them what else is going on in their hometown of Derry, Maine. This takes place much later than it, but it is still the town of Derry is still very much haunted by some sort of presence. It's not necessarily a dark presence, not like in it, but it's still creepy. And the main characters just begin to realize that there's so much more to reality than what meets the eye. And I loved the main characters in this story. The older gentleman is hilarious, and the woman in the story, I guess you could call her the romantic aspect of the story, she's sweet and feisty, and then the friends, the other side characters, are just great. I think one of the reasons I liked it was because they were all older, and they all just had that distinct quality about them that makes them so entertaining. I also enjoyed how the characters came to be involved in the plot and how information was sort of presented to them, how they discovered what was happening in the story. The story starts very slowly, but it gives you a lot of time to get to know the characters, and I personally really enjoyed that. Some themes covered in this book include the value of a human life, even if it's just one human and even if it's just a child. It also touches on free will again. How much choice do these characters have in becoming involved in this storyline? I think it's something that Stephen King touches on a lot in these particular books. And it also brings up the question of what is a human soul and how can it be influenced and changed for better or worse. Finally, one note about Insomnia is that it's not a horror story. It's not like It or The Shining. This is more of a supernatural thriller story, and the biggest problem you're probably going to have with it is that it's super long, and it does take quite a while to get into the actual plot of the story. However, despite all that, it's my second favorite Stephen King book that I've read so far. And then finally, I read 11/22/63 by Stephen King, which is another chunker. And in 11/22/63, a man is roped into going back in time to stop the Kennedy assassination. It's really broken up into, I sort of thinking over it, I think it was broken up into 4 main parts. The first part is the main character being introduced to this concept of traveling back in time, and how he becomes convicted that he should go back and attempt to stop the Kennedy assassination. The second part of the book deals with the question of, could this even work? So you're given a little experiment. He goes back in time and he tries to stop the murder of somebody back in Derry, Maine. And it takes you right back to that environment, that setting from it, and it is creepy and brilliant. And you find out that yes, in fact, changing one aspect of the past, saving one person's life, can have vast effects. And then the third part of the book is actually going back in time to the 60s to try and stop the assassination of Kennedy. The author spends many, many years there trying to gather information, stalking Oswald, figuring out how he's going to do it, and just making these various, just figuring out how he's going to stop him, and then ultimately that day, can he stop the Kennedy assassination? And then the final part is going back to the present day and seeing the results of his actions. And that was actually probably the most interesting part of the story, because the results of his actions were pretty intense, and for a second they're typical of what you might expect, but it ends up being pretty dark. So as for this story, I really enjoyed the historical aspects of it. I thought that was really entertaining, especially when he was back in Derry, Maine, and then back in the 60s when he was stalking Lee Harvey Oswald and getting to know those characters. I really enjoyed the side characters in the book, especially during that third phase of the book where he's in the 60s and getting to know people down in Texas. That is where the main character's story becomes personal. And I enjoyed that part to a certain extent. I also really enjoyed how Stephen King built time travel into this story. You know, every story you jump into about time travel is going to have its own set of unique rules, and I like the way that Stephen King built this particular time travel story and the effects that it has on the world that we live in. I'd say the biggest con for this book is that it's way too long. I mean, look at it. It's just massive. It's giant, okay? I really feel that it could have been cut and edited to be a more reasonable size. And I know that it's difficult because it spans so many years, and then you want your characters to have time to grow and develop so that you can tell a more personal story as well. And that more personal story provides motivation for the character to do what he does. But I thought parts of it were really boring. I'm not going to get into which parts I thought were boring, but there was just a lot of it that I was like, well, am I going to keep reading? Yeah, because I want to know if he can stop this assassination. So I did finish the book. I'm glad I finished it, but I really think it seriously could have been shorter. As for some themes that crop up in this story, obviously you're dealing with time and aging and how both of those aspects work in our lives. Also, free will. How much free will does this character have? And how much do his actions affect the actions of the world around him? Really, what does it mean? What is the value and worth of saving one person? And how does saving one person change the rest of the structure of the world and the lives of those around you? I will say that 11/22/63 was my least favorite of these three books. It was my least favorite because I didn't enjoy the main character as much, and I thought it was too long. So, have you read any of these Stephen King books? And if so, which ones, and what did you think of them? I still think my favorite Stephen King book so far is The Shining, and I don't know if I'll ever read anything better than it. Let me know what your favorite Stephen King books are, and if you have any that you think I should read next. I know he just came out with The Outsider that I want to read, and I also want to read Revival. And I also watched a video that I'll link below about Carrie that made me quite interested in reading that as well. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on these books and other Stephen King novels. Let me know in the comments down below. I hope you guys all have a great day. Thanks. Bye.